Hey YouTube, working on a Case 580 CK. I don't know whether they call them a CK or a 580B, but I believe it's a mid-70s machine, but the decals on it have 580B, but also Construction King. And I've seen, looking for parts, I've got it all over the place. Like, it's listed as 580 CK, some places it's 580B. So I've been calling it a 580B, but anyway, it's not in too bad a shape. But the one thing that had going on when I got it was some water in the transmission. So I did some research online and found out that the tranny cooler in the bottom of the radiator is notorious for leaking. So pulled the radiator out of it, got some pieces I'm painting as I put it back together here. Eventually maybe I'll paint the whole machine, but for now it's good enough to, you know, clean it up a little as I'm putting it back together. But anyway, I just wanted to talk a little bit about getting that radiator out. It is a pain in the rear. So these frame rails along the side, these are your hydraulic tanks, and then they've got a crossover hose here crossing between the two halves, and these are actually screw-in iron pipe fittings. And I debated whether to take these out, but with the radiator in, they are actually on this rubber. The radiator's butted up against. So if you're starting to work on one, you're going to see that from the front, that there's real little clearance. The radiator's butted up right against this. So getting these out, I was worried about. I mean, I was taking a bad radiator out, so tearing the radiator up wouldn't be too big of a deal, but I was worried about being able to get this in and putting a 90 fitting in here. But what I'm worried about is if I put a 90 fitting in, I think I'm going to be pretty tight to this piece of iron here. So I left it as it was factory. I mean, I think if you're pretty motivated to put a couple 90s in there, you might save yourself a little bit of headache down the road. But at the end of the day, even with a 90 in here, the corner of the elbow is still going to touch the radiator frame. So you're still going to, the problem that you're going to have if you're getting this radiator out of here, you'll find out real quick, you need to lean it forward, and you can't do that because of this crossover pipe. Because the problem is that radiator's so thick, it's sitting in here sideways, and this looks like a lot of room now that everything's out of here, but I've got the water pump out of this engine. So once you get the water pump pulley, get the fan on there, you're right up against almost, you know, the fan's inside the cowling in the radiator, so there's not a lot of room to wiggle or work or do whatever you need to do there. So I ended up using a box end wrench and taking the 4 bolts out of the water pump pulley and taking the fan off and wriggling it out of there. And let me tell you what, it's jammed into the fins on the radiator. So I haven't put the radiator back, the new one back in here yet. They actually sent me one without a tranny cooler, so I'm dealing with yesterday's tractors, trying to get that sorted out and getting a new radiator here. I thought this was going to be a one-day job, and I've been waiting for, 12 days for a second radiator to show up. So, but we'll get her in there. In the meantime, while I got this all apart, I decided to put a new belt on it, obviously. But I did sneak a second belt in there and zip tie it to the frame rails. So figuring down the road, if this belt breaks, I can cut those zip ties and pull that up and pop that into place. But to get the belt in, you've got to pull that down here. This little spider spline shaft jobby here, there's 4 bolts holding that spider onto this crank pulley. So you got to take their 5/8 wrench, take those 4 bolts off, just turn the crank pulley slowly, and then this spider was seized to this spline shaft. So it ended up, I figured while I got this all apart, I might as well get in here and pull this hydraulic pump out. So it wasn't too bad. It's two 3/4 bolts. You got to take this hydraulic fitting off and then this hydraulic soft line. And I ended up just slitting it. It's slit right now. It's right here. So I got to pop that off and run into the hydraulic shop and get a piece of replacement hose. But pull this guy off, take this fitting off, pull these 2 3/4 out, and then there's another guy on YouTube, give him a shout out, but he made a puller. So I did the same thing. You just slide it behind. It's just a piece of steel bar. I don't know what it is, probably not quite 1/2 inch, 3/8 maybe, 3/8 bar that I cut off to match the size of that pump there, that frame of the pump. And then I just took some all thread and welded it on there. If I can get the thing back out of there. I'll show you. Just migged on a couple pieces of all thread, and then a couple pieces of channel, and put that on there, and a couple nuts, and walk it right out. Just put a bar of iron across the front of the frame, and you know, just use it as a puller. But make two of those, one for each side of the pump, and you can pull it out pretty easy. Just walk straight out. But the puller is definitely the way to go if you want to pull this pump out, because it's real. It's in love with this old steel, I can tell you that. Aluminum pump housing. Trying to think of what else to tell you about it. Oh, the one thing that got me while I was pulling the radiator out, the bottom of this radiator's got two threaded studs on it with a 9/16 nut. And I assumed, you know what happens when you assume, right? I assumed that those nuts were gone. Everybody online was saying, oh, those nuts aren't there. They're just pins, and you can pull the radiator out. Well, mine, the nuts are still good and tight on there. And that sits down, that plate down there, those studs sit down in these notches. So you don't need to take the nuts all the way off. Just get them loose and you can slide them forward. But I didn't know that, and I could not get that radiator out of the bottom of that. So I actually went after these bolts here. Let me move this cardboard here. I actually took a burr, a real long burr on a die grinder, and cut two notches in this cowling on the radiator so that I could get a 3/4 socket down onto those big bolts. So I would just kind of cut a notch in the cowling on both sides. It was a pain in the rear because you got three socket extensions to get your ratchet up top and get onto these 3/4 bolts. But I ended up taking these two off, thinking this whole plate had come off. And this plate actually has, I don't know if I can show you, it's got a hoop. Get a flashlight. It's got a hoop of metal. That piece of metal you're looking at there around that shaft, that's attached to the bottom of this plate. So you can't pull the plate up and out of there unless you cut that off. So it's one piece. So the only way to get that plate out of there is to pull that shaft out. So I got these two bolts out, and then I can't get the plate out, but at least it loosened up the radiator. But still, you can't pull your radiator out with this plate off. You got to get those nuts loosened up. So there is, you can see, zoom in there. See that hole down there in the frame? They're not directly in line with that, but they're close enough that with a 9/16 socket, you can get up there from the bottom and get a socket onto that stud on the bottom of the radiator and get that nut buzzed off there. So that's apparently what those holes are for in the frame. I assume they're all over the place. I assume they're just drain holes, but they line up close enough to those notches that you can get those nuts off the bottom of that radiator. So just do that instead of taking that plate off, and I think you're all right, because as soon as you loosen those nuts off, you're able to rock that radiator as much as you can in here. So the only thing I might try if I was to do it again, I took the water pump out after I got the radiator out, and I'll show you what the water pump looks like. But I don't know if the water pump fins, if the clearance here, I mean, you probably got an inch, maybe an inch and a half. So I don't know if you could take the bolts out of the water pump, and instead of getting the fan off the front, take the water pump and slide it forward and then pull it out. I don't know. If I was kind of thinking about doing that to get it back in, is put the radiator in first before the water pump, and then put the water pump pulley, and the fan together, and then try to slide that in there as an assembly. I don't think it's going to fit, but it's just another idea. Might be another way to skin the cat. But you basically, it's just a clearance problem. There's a lot that jams in there between that crossover hose is the pain in the rear. It really is. If you could have that out of there, then you can lean that radiator forward, and you'd have all the clearance you need behind it to get in there and get the fan out of the way, and the pulley and the water pump out of the way, and then you could pull the radiator right out. I've saw a couple videos of guys doing the same job, and they were saying to getting it back in, they didn't put a scratch in the radiator. So I'm a bit skeptical on putting it back in and not scratching it, because it was a bear getting it out. So we'll see. I'm hoping I got the same story when I'm done. Maybe I'll give you an update after I get it in if I remember. But anyway, I figured I'd buy a new water pump, new thermostat while I'm at it, and paint up some parts. So got some parts drying, and you know, painted up some bits and pieces, and got a new there's a new radiator there from yesterday's tractor. That's the right one. So this is what you want: a couple transmission cooler lines. This is different than the factory. These are male fittings. So the factory radiator, I don't know if these are the same and they've just got a bung in there. I'm guessing that's what it is, but I'll show you what mine was from the factory. There's a new water pump, new thermostat, and some old parts painted up. Have trouble putting rusty parts back in without at least cleaning them up a little bit. But the factory radiator, so this female hydraulic fitting was off the machine. So that's your hydraulic line from the transmission, and then this male fitting is what was going into the radiator cooler. So they just had the female bungs on there. So I'm guessing that's what that radiator has in it. And they just put some male pipe adapters there, so I'll have to get a different hose made up. Figured these are probably older than I am, so we'll get a couple new hoses made up, and probably ought to paint my fan while I'm on it. Anyway, we'll get her put back together, and hopefully I'll give you guys an update and give you some tricks on how to get her back together. So, all right, well, thanks for tuning in.